Karina, thank you. Good day, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Walt, Whitecotton. I've been in the cloud for about 10 years, and we'll be talking a little bit about the Edge products. And as Karina kind of indicated, we usually spend a significant amount of time on this because there's a lot of variables. Having said that, our contact information is later in this deck, and you'll get that information so you can ping us if there's a question or a spark of interest and you want to have a follow-on discussion. So Ryan, if you can go to the next slide. Why are we here? I think when people look at this quote from Gartner and kind of think just notionally with your smartphone and think about what that was just a few years ago with just pictures, and to what potentially, like I use my phone, it helps me with navigating traffic across the national capital region, and the crowdsourcing information that's tied to that device is allowing us to leverage some of the things that are tied to edge computing. So looking at artificial intelligence and ML models that route me relative to crowdsourcing with not only my phone, but thousands of others in the Washington, D.C. metro area when we were commuting more often, as opposed to now these days. But the point with this slide is that going forward, as more and more things get IP enabled or have a sensor that emits signals, data that was historically created in the data center is no longer the center of this explosion of information. It's actually coming from the edge. And so Microsoft has invested significant technology as well as software and hardware to leverage this so you can get those patterns and those benefits, not only in the commercial world, like when it comes to driving safely and getting routed around DC, but also help us leverage information. There's several companies as well as many government agencies that have used these hybrid solution sets and have them accredited and certified to operate from the Department of Defense to pretty much every cabinet level position with the Department of deployed and used across the government widely. Next slide, please. So some of the reasons that folks are looking, or organizations are looking at hybrid, are tied to these bullet points. And so of late, with Ryan and I's conversations over the last several months, we're seeing a lot of folks with another one that's tied to essentially learning hyperscale cloud. And we'll get into some of those technical pieces later. But as you can see with the information on the right side of the slide, significant interest both from commercial and government agencies and others that have actually built multi-cloud strategies. And as I alluded to earlier with that slide, significant amounts of data are coming outside of the data center. So it's calling us to rethink how we use information, and data is kind of becoming the new oil or the gold when it comes to leveraging information from that. And so hybrid architectures allowed us to speed up things relative to deployments and architectures at the edge, make sense of things in a timely manner, and then potentially not even send stuff to the data center anymore. And there are several other use cases where folks are lifting and shifting applications or potentially building things as they move forward to modernize them. Next slide, Ryan. So some of the things that we look at as characteristics that should be thought about as you make investments in hybrid architectures and hybrid technology. You need a comprehensive, all-inclusive kind of capability where the ecosystem tied to these 5 bullet points has got mutual benefits for the end user, our OEM partners, and then obviously us as a company to derive benefits that allow you to leverage these things, as I mentioned earlier, to derive public safety benefits, profit motives, things of that nature. And then there's others that are tied to the speed of light and latency, where we can't operate without a hybrid operator that has something tied to the edge, the core, and potentially hyperscale cloud. And we'll cover some of those concepts in some of the following slides. The latest type of, the current and the more prevalent use case for supporting hybrid is that some companies or organizations do not want to put regulated or certain types of protected information into the cloud or the public cloud. And so they look for ways to build systems and services potentially linked on premises, and then maybe strip out certain parts of data and put that up in the hyperscale cloud, prevent things like data exposure or breaches. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about, back to those pillars there that you look in the center part of the slide. So things that are tied to what should you look for to get consistency and holistic approaches from a cloud service provider, and the things that are tied to developing hybrid capability or pattern. And so some of the foundational aspects are tied to the C2 pieces in the top part of the slide. And so when you think about building something in hybrid mode, you're going to have an application or maybe data that resides in an on-premise hybrid implementation as well as in the hyperscale cloud. So you need things such as your code base, the databases, the environments to be consistent when it comes to the tooling. And then as a developer or working things like an identity and jumping around relative to these 5 pillars, things that people are familiar with when it comes to like a baseline of APIs. Folks from the legacy of .NET, Visual Studio, migrating to something like Azure DevOps, it provides you, for the developers, a consistent platform where folks are familiar and comfortable with these things. For instance, Visual Studio Team Service is an example from an app development perspective. Things that are tied to data, tied to SQL, databases that are essentially consistent, that are operating in the cloud if you desire to go there, or pull that into a hybrid on-premise implementation, things like Postgres, NoSQL, those common databases, and having the consistency between what you have in the cloud as well as on-premise, another important aspect of these pillars. And one of the biggest ones, when you think about the largest identity solution set on the planet, Active Directory, and looking at how that might work in an Azure Active Directory implementation, or potentially federating that with Azure Active Directory federated services. Again, those consistent tool sets, being able to use things that you're familiar with in the cloud and on-premise provide you that comprehensive as well as consistent platform. And the last one is when you think about, and we're going to talk a little bit about this with Arc, with our partners shortly, but having a platform that provides the same policies, things like RBAC and implementation, so that you have a secure platform and can implement that with holistic governance that works the same in both platforms, either on-premise or in hyperscale cloud. These are all key attributes and those pillars that contribute to things that are tied to our hybrid cloud platform. Next slide, please. I won't spend a whole lot of time on these, but as I kind of alluded to earlier, there's several types of use cases. We have 3 different products that Ryan will talk about shortly, but each one of these has kind of nuanced approaches and layers and architecture relative to the specifics of your requirements. And so that comprehensive platform can meet all of these use cases and many others that are out there. Next. And then from a high level picture, we would spend a lot more time talking about this if we had some more available tonight, but we're going to focus primarily on the purple column there, about 2/3 of the way to the right. But the point in showing this from an intelligent edge perspective and developing hybrid solutions and giving you kind of a layout of what the product sets are holistically from our leadership perspective, and Satya has talked about this, we're providing you a capability like an Azure Sphere microcontroller, very inexpensive, but very singly purpose-built to allow you to take information from the edge, for instance, like something's open or closed, or it's hot, or it's vibrating, and then leverage that across this essentially spectrum of capabilities and giving you some information and then putting it in where it makes sense based upon your requirements and your needs or speed to get information at the edge. You can leverage all of these devices and in combination derive an architecture that really suits your purpose, your need and requirements, as well as your mission. And moving to the right, if you think about capabilities, go from an IoT device, moving to an edge device that's got more compute, more storage capability, to the Stack Edge and the Stack Hub that we're going to spend a little bit more time today talking about, and the hyperscale. You have a certain amount of form factor, low and very simple on the left side, and moving all the way up, we got tremendous capability and random, just unbelievable capacities, but simple form factors relative to how you interface through the portal. And so picking and choosing and building this gives you a lot of variability. And that's why we mentioned earlier, a lot of complicated potential architectures, and getting it right is the goal that myself and Ryan would focus on if you have an interest in taking this conversation further. Next slide, please. Ryan, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Walt. So by way of introduction, my name is Ryan Zoeller. I work in the federal space alongside Walt, covering our federal DoD partners and customers, and happy to be presenting tonight on our set of edge workloads and portfolio. So we're going to touch on each of these. It's going to go pretty quick. I'll add a little bit of commentary as we go through based on some experience and some learnings. And as Walt said, we're happy to engage after this conversation during a Q&A or in the future with our contact information. So what you're looking at here is a set of those edge product lines that fell within that purple column of edge products from the previous slide Walt talked about. And so I want to touch on each of these briefly, understand what the use case is, understand when it makes sense to use those versus the hyperscale cloud, and how the 3 products are differentiated. And so you can kind of see just a few bullets here, but as we go into that, Let's start with Azure Stack Hub. So Azure Stack Hub has been out for several years, and it's really our product around bringing a subset of Azure services into your data center or into your customer's data center. And really the value prop or the reason by which you would want to use an Azure Stack Hub is really highlighted on the right. So it's really around scenarios where you have an investment in the hyperscale cloud in Azure, but you've got workloads or you've got situations, be it a tactical edge, data sovereignty, classified environment, where you need to run those workloads at the edge, not in the hyperscale cloud. And you want to take those investments in tooling and knowledge of the Azure ecosystem, and you want to be able to apply those out to the edge. And so that's one scenario. The second one's really around regulatory or data sovereignty, or as we refer to it at Microsoft, data gravity. And so where that data needs to sit and you want to bring those Azure services closer. And then finally, it's all about maybe I want to do some app modernization. And app modernization might be using some of the platform services or the infrastructure as code that we have built in through our Azure Resource Management API that's exposed from the Azure Stack Hub. And so on the left-hand side, what you'll see is some of the characteristics of Azure Stack Hub. It's a purpose-built system. So think of it as an appliance where you partner with our OEMs, and then you get this subset of hardware to run, and then you operate it in your data center, and you control it similar to how Microsoft would operate Azure regions on behalf of your customers. And so some of the use cases that we typically see, again, are really around disconnected environments. So if you've got those disconnected scenarios and you want to bring Azure services there, you can do so. Also, field operations. Or humanitarian assistance. We've seen scenarios there across, multiple customers within the federal, not only US, but worldwide. And if you look at this from a developer perspective or from an IT pro, it's really around DevSecOps. And DevSecOps is all about how do I hydrate my workload and make that available end to end and achieve that, accreditation or ATO, if you will, within the defense space. And so if you look at Azure, Azure is just a targeted endpoint. It's an API, and we're doing the same thing with Azure Stack Hub. So you see, I can just put my workloads within this pipeline, and that pipeline here, we're illustrating Azure DevOps, but this could be any sort of IDE or CI/CD pipeline that your organization is using. And then just look at Azure as a targeted endpoint or release. Same thing with Azure Stack Hub. And maybe the same thing with something with your on-premises data center. And so we can understand Azure Resource Management templates on Azure Stack Hub, similar to how we do that in Azure. Okay, so popping over to Azure Stack Edge. So Azure Stack Edge is another hardware appliance. This hardware appliance has got a little different business model, and by which you order this from the Azure portal. So this is hardware as a service straight from Microsoft. And the use cases that you really see around Azure Stack Edge are highlighted on the right. And so typically what we're seeing is customers that are developing cloud native applications and workloads, and they're looking at Kubernetes or they're looking at some sort of Docker container, and they want to have massive amounts of ingestion at the edge, and then they want to bring that compute processing closer to where that data is being generated. That's where they'll start to look at things like Azure Stack Edge. And so a scenario could be, training that machine learning model up in Azure, taking that trained model out to the edge, and then bringing in data, be it from a drone feed or whatever sort of collection endpoint, and being able to process that through, let's say, some cognitive services that are looking for, image recognition or, speech to text or something of that nature. And so those are sort of the scenarios that we're seeing with Azure Stack Edge. And again, this is going to support, today it supports containers, and we'll have Kubernetes, but in the future we have a roadmap for VMs, and we're also bringing some other capabilities to the Azure Stack Edge appliance. These are the appliances that we have available. So we've got the commercial series appliances that you see on the left. So I think the most intriguing that we're seeing now, a lot of interest in, is the new T4 GPU. That's a part of the commercial series. And then, of course, we've announced some ruggedized series that we're going to be bringing to the market as well. And if you look at a solution architecture around what does this really do and what does this mean for you or your customers, it allows you to take those various on-premises devices and be able to suck in the data and ingest that, and then do that local compute. And that doesn't mean that it's replacing the hyperscale cloud. It's just that local first line element. And you can then push it up to the hyperscale cloud for additional analytics or processing or storage for long-term retention. So this is just a basic diagram of how those can be used together. Some scenarios that we've seen with customers and partners is really around retail out of stock detection. So you can see here, we're using our cloud services by just using existing video camera captures, as well as operating rooms. So Olympus did a great study. You can look at it out here on YouTube, where they've done hospital OR prep. And so they had cameras that are looking at the OR, making sure everything's ready to go before they, bring in the patient and the staff to do their work. Another scenario I think that's relevant. This is manufacturing, but across federal specifically. This can apply in many different capacities, but this is really around making sure that PPE and different scenarios are in place, as well as damaged product control. And so if you look at bringing in those existing cameras and then training some model to look at that floor, and then now you can get those metrics and then put those into an automation workflow and then take action on those based on what you're finding. Okay, so let's pivot to Azure Stack Hci. So Azure Stack Hci is a third appliance that's available. And this is really around the ability to run virtualized applications on-prem, as well as replace those, maybe that aging hardware or doing a refresh for those branch offices. And so this doesn't have the Azure control plane that sits on it, but this is really more around virtualization workloads and potentially running, Windows or Linux or containers at the edge, and doing that on a hyper-converged architecture. So it's a little bit different than what you'll see with an Azure Stack Hub. So the scenarios, again, are on the right. You can connect this to the Azure Hyperscale Cloud. And what we've done is we've wrapped this with a very easy admin UI called Windows Admin Center. And so what Windows Admin Center does is it gives you a lot of capabilities to automate common tasks that you find to be difficult to repeat. And so what we're doing is we're bringing in all of that IP from Microsoft, and we're kind of putting that into those workflows. And then it's able for you to easily make those deployment efforts. And so if you look at what Azure Stack Hci looks like under the hood, it's really just a validated partner hardware solution. We've got over 20 partners that we're going to market with Azure Stack Hci. And then on top of that, we're running Windows Server 2019 hyper-converged architecture, layering it on top with Windows Admin Center, and then you're able to connect it into Azure from a hybrid perspective. So you can do things like disaster recovery of those workloads, backup in DR, maybe some log analytics or application performance monitoring or whatever it might be. So there's many scenarios. And then again, we're supporting the workloads that you have today. So Windows, Linux, anything that can be virtualized can run on Azure Stack Hci. And then you're seeing those common administrative interfaces that you'd have to do in order to maintain an HCI environment. And what we're doing is we're putting those all within the Windows Admin Center. And so that's got a lot of workflows that are in there that are wizard driven that allow you to do that automation at scale. So building clusters, building machines, automating some of the hardware replacement, those sorts of things. So some of the use cases that we see around Azure Stack Hci are really around like branch and edge offices, VDI scenarios. Maybe you've got some high performance IO around SQL Server, endpoint virtualization, and scale out storage. And so traditional HCI approach. So another thing that I want to call out before we shift to the last section that I want to cover is we've published a lot of these hybrid cloud patterns out on Azure.com. And so I added the GitHub link here at the bottom, so you'll be able to take this and look at that after the presentation. But go out there and check those out. We've got a lot of quick start templates that are available for code, both for Azure Stack Hub, for Edge, and then soon over time we'll likely have some things out there for HCI and others. But this is a great area to kind of understand what do these patterns look like, how do they interact with the edge and the hyperscale, and then once you start to develop and deploy those, you can start to get your idea of how these things work and then build your code on top of that. So great places to start. We're constantly adding and iterating to that. Okay, so this brings me to the last section that I want to cover, and this is one of the newest pieces. So if you attended Julia White's session this morning, there was a big hybrid event. So I'll let the following presenters talk a little bit more about that and get into detail with the demo. But Azure Arc is a service that we unveiled at Ignite last year in November in Orlando. And this is really about extending our control plane and making it available to manage systems that are outside of Azure. And so it's a common theme that we're hearing with customers especially within the federal space, is they like what is available in Azure. They like the centralized management and governance, but it's very difficult when they can't move those workloads to Azure, and they may not need to go to maybe an Azure Stack Hub or an Edge. They're fine with what they're doing, but they just want to take advantage. And that's really what Azure Arc is trying to solve. It's really around bringing those non-Azure assets and bring them in under Azure management. And then now with that, I can do some very interesting things around governance or policy. So for example, a few of the scenarios that we're unveiling with Azure Arc are Azure Arc for servers. So that's going to manage your server infrastructure regardless of where it's at, on premises, private cloud, maybe it's in a different public cloud. The second one is going to be around Azure Arc for Kubernetes. And so how do I manage Kubernetes at scale across my IT estate? And then the final one is around data services. And so if we look at what this looks like from a management perspective, Azure is kind of your control plane and management plane for your Azure assets. And so what we're doing is we're essentially extending that. And now you can bring in those systems that are in data centers, branch offices, multi-cloud. So it's about the governance and management story. It's not about bringing services per se into your data center. But that's coming when you look at things like our data services and other options. So let me give you a quick takeaway for each one of the services that we're unveiling with Azure Arc today. So the first one's Azure Arc for servers. So it's all about inventory, governance, being able to do some role-based access, integrate it with Lighthouse. So for those MSPs and partners that are out there that manage multiple Azure subscriptions, these will integrate, because what ends up happening is these VMs and workloads become Azure resources. And so then I can use other Azure services to overlay and start to control those. The second one is around Azure Arc for Kubernetes. And so it's going to provide centralized management for your Kubernetes clusters, regardless of where they're at. And so you can do things like assign policy and make sure that your clusters are set up to the way that they need to be within your enterprise or organization. You can put those into your GitOps pipeline, and then you can start to, administer what you want those clusters to look like. What should the configuration be? What sort of applications should go on there? Manage the pods, the scale out. All of that from a centralized control plane up in Azure. And then finally, we're unveiling, and this is, I think we just got an update on this today from the hybrid session this morning. This is about Azure Arc for data services. And so this one is still in a private preview, so you have to sign up on the Azure portal. And what this will do is allow you to bring Azure managed instances of SQL as well as Postgres to the edge and run it on your appliances. And so this is that true, how do I get as a service, like database as a service, in my data center without it running in Azure? And so that's really what we're kind of taking away with Arc for data services. So if you want to go out and take a look at that, we can manage OpenShift or AKS Engine or workloads in GCP or AWS. So it doesn't matter as long as it's a Kubernetes cluster. I think it's version 1.14 or later, we can take it under Arc management. And so that's a lot in a very short period of time. As Karina mentioned, we typically spend a few hours going through these products. You can learn more on the entire portfolio of hybrid out on azure.com/hybrid. Walt and myself's email and contact information is here. So please reach out to us from a federal perspective. We can do a much deeper follow-up with your organization. And with that, I don't want to shortchange Steve and Mike, but I want to introduce Steve and Mike from Avanade, and they are going to show a demo on Arc, and they've done a really good workflow here. So Steve, over to you.